So something massive is unfolding in the world's deadliest conflict, and almost no one knows anything about it. Indeed, the country that last broke apart, giving us the world's newest country, Sudan, is on the verge of breaking apart again. A bloody civil war that began as a power struggle between two former colleague generals has now morphed into a brutal, sprawling catastrophe that's killing hundreds of thousands, displacing millions, and threatening to fracture the country entirely into basically two rival states. With that in mind, in this video I wanted to properly unpack what is happening in Sudan, why it's being overlooked so much despite its severity, how it's reached this breaking point, why it risks a even Libya-style partition, and what it means for not just Africa's stability, but why it matters so much for everything from the Middle East to even Ukraine and more. Let's get into it.
This is The Global Gambit.
How you going, everyone? Welcome back to The Global Gambit, where we deep dive into various conflicts on this channel, various global issues, but in this case, one of the bloodiest, yet most overlooked, conflicts of the 21st century, Sudan's civil war. This topic is especially close to my heart, having lived in Africa myself and seen both hand the continent's immense potential, but its also heartbreaking fragility. It's given me a personal appreciation for why conflicts like this do matter, not just for Africa, but for the wider world, and how certain countries, in this case a certain Middle East country, which we'll come to later, really take advantage in stirring up the instability, the chaos, for their interests, for their means to an end. Now, Sudan's civil war erupted in April 2023, in a long brewing feud between the Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF, led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and a powerful paramilitary group called the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, led by Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, or known from here on out as Hamedi, exploded into open combat. Since then, the war has become one of the bloodiest of this century, completely disregarded by the media and most of the global north. That being said, what do you guys think about it? If you are from Sudan or you have heritage in the broader continent of Africa, then let me know in the comments below. I'd be very keen to hear what you have to say and what you think should be being done. Now, by US government estimates, at least 150,000 people have been killed in the first year, just in 2023-24. More recent counts put the toll death much higher. Some sources suggest nearly 500,000 people have been killed, not just casualties killed. So let that sink in. That's more than Gaza, Ukraine, and the ongoing civil war in Myanmar, another conflict often overlooked. Sudan barely makes international headlines. The UN, for what it's worth, has called it the world's biggest displacement crisis, with more than 12 million people fleeing their homes. Nearly 25 million face acute food insecurity, and half the population is at famine. Yet aid to Sudan has been a fraction, unsurprisingly, of what Ukraine receives, or even a fraction of that of what Gaza receives, despite, the absurd difference in land and also population affected. The world, frankly, just doesn't care. Understand how Sudan got here, we have to look a little bit further back. For 3 decades, dictator Omar al-Bashir ruled Sudan with an iron fist, using ethnic militias, Islamic loyalists, and the military to stay in power. Among his enforcers were the Janjaweed, notorious for atrocities in Darfur in the early 2000s, and a campaign so brutal that the International Criminal Court, ICC, later charged Bashir with genocide. The Janjaweed's commander, Hamedi, would later transform his militia into this Rapid Support Forces, a paramilitary empire that controlled basically gold mines, smuggling routes, and regional alliances stretching into Libya, Chad, and the Gulf. When Bashir was finally overthrown in 2019, the RSF helped the army remove him, and for a brief moment, Sudan had a chance, a fragile civil-military transition supported by the West, something that I focused on a lot during that period. But within a couple of years, that dream was dead. Burhan's army staged a coup, dissolved the civilian government, and restored military rule. No one could have imagined, though, what happened after that, thinking that was bad enough. 2 years later, the uneasy alliance by Burhan and Hamedi shattered completely, and the country plunged into this current chaos of war. So today, Sudan is effectively divided between two parallel governments. In the east, along the Red Sea, the Sudanese armed forces control Port Sudan, the de facto capital. Conversely, in the west, the RSF controls almost all of Darfur, and now much of another area called Kordofan as well. Each side is backed by foreign patrons. The UAE especially has supplied drones, money and weapons to the RSF, something Abu Dhabi unsurprisingly officially denies. Conversely, Iran, Turkey and Russia have backed the Sudanese army, often trading arms for gold or strategic assets. Russia's Wagner Group has operated in Sudan's mines for years, helping to fund Putin's war in Ukraine. And the result is therefore a war that's not just Sudanese, it's a proxy conflict of the most classical order, shaped by competing Gulf, Iranian and broader global interests. But this is what prompted this video for me, because in October of 2025, the conflict entered a terrifying new phase. After what was basically a 18-month siege, the RSF seized control of a place known as El Fasher, the last major city in Darfur, still held by the SAF. The city's fall therefore wasn't a battlefield loss, it was a massacre. Satellite images analysed by different groups, including Yale's Humanitarian Research Lab, showed mass graves and clusters of bodies near defensive berms encircling the city. Human Rights Watch have called it a horrifying truth, evidence that the RSF was executing civilians as they fled. An estimated 2,000 people were killed in El Fasher alone. Tens of thousands have fled from what they could escape from, and entire neighbourhoods have been razed. And with that in mind, the RSF have completed its takeover of Western Sudan, an area roughly the size of France. It now governs Darfur as basically a non-autonomous state, and there have been previous debates about whether or not Darfur could break away because of different ethnic and religious groups that live out there. But if you now have a semi-governing state ruled by a different entity, then that makes it somewhat easier to manage, even if it isn't internationally recognised, especially under something as heinous as the RSF. It sounds like the early stages of partition is the point, and that's largely because it is. Now, after consolidating Darfur, the RSF has pushed eastwards into Kordofan, a region bridging Sudan's two halves and home to vital roads, oil pipelines and the country's agricultural heartland. For months, Kordofan looked like the next domino to fall, but in September of 2025, the army did strike back. Sudan's military captured the strategic city of Bara and logistics hub along what's known as Export Road, connecting Khartoum to El Bilid, the city of North Kordofan. This wasn't a symbolic victory either, it was very much a logistical one. By reclaiming Bara, the SAF, the army, cut the RSF's supply lines between Darfur and South Sudan, isolating its fighters and crippling their ability to move weapons or reinforcements. The Sudanese drones, backed by Iranian technology, bombarded RSF positions for weeks before ground troops swept in. Local civilians, long terrorised by RSF raids, reportedly sided with the army, helping to accelerate the militia's retreat. And those who follow this on an in-depth basis now say that this could be a turning point, if the army can hold that line. But Sudan's recent history suggests victories are rarely permanent. But this leads us all to the main question, and where it really becomes dangerous. Could Sudan actually split? Because what is emerging is a de facto two-state reality. In the east, run by the recognised Sudanese armed forces, controlling the capital, the Red Sea ports, and international backing. But the west, dominated by the RSF, running its own administration, economy and supply routes through Chad and South Sudan. It sounds familiar, perhaps those of you who follow this a little bit, because it's eerily similar to Libya, where rival governments in Tripoli and Benghazi have coexisted and fought for the best part of a decade now. If Sudan follows that path, it won't just divide the country, therefore it will reshape the map of northeastern Africa, putting pressure on the Nile, on Egypt, on Ethiopia, on other parts of the countries surrounding it that already have volatility, terrorism and such to think about. The Red Sea coast could become a militarized zone, contested by Iran, the UAE, by Russia. Darfur, with its mineral wealth and cross-border trade, could morph into a warlord-run-like state akin to eastern Libya. And think about it, if they control, the RSF controls all these resources and supply links and logistical chains, then they have the ability to fund and create and ensure the stability, at least in the short to medium term, of their de facto but unrecognised nation state. And South Sudan, already fragile, could face renewed pressure along its northern border, threatening another humanitarian spiral for even broader groups of people. Even now, some people argue the split has already happened in practice. The question is whether or not it becomes formalised. But in particular, I wanted to consider the role of international players here, because more than anywhere in the modern world, when it comes to fragile and unstable areas, the role of foreign interference or just simply engagement can be the determinant factor when it comes to the duration, severity, and global repercussions from that conflict. The Gulf states, for example, want to funnel weapons, Iran sends its drones, and Russia eyes access to Port Sudan for a long-standing naval base. But one country in particular has stood out in this conflict now, the United Arab Emirates. Investigations by journalists and the US intelligence networks have found that the UAE has been funneling weapons at an unprecedented rate, confusingly for some as to why Sudan of all countries. But these have included Chinese-made CH-9 drones, artillery and ammunition, all through to the RSF via routes that include Chad, Somalia and Libya. The drones, capable of flying for 24 hours and firing precision missiles, have dramatically increased what would otherwise be a much outweighed group next to the actual national military forces in terms of its firepower, endurance, and its ability to have complete dominance over Darfur skies. Many officials said that these shipments have prolonged the war and undermined any form of diplomatic solution. And some have even put it as bluntly that the war would be over if it would not be for the UAE. The only thing keeping the RSF alive is Emirati money and weapons. Therefore, Washington, interestingly, the Trump administration, has accused both sides of war crimes and formally accused the RSF of attempted genocide and ethnic cleansing. But it has never really called out directly Abu Dhabi by name. Diplomats describe that as strategic silence. The US doesn't want to rupture ties with one of its most important and powerful Gulf partners, and the UAE, unsurprisingly, will deny any and all allegations, saying its cargo planes carry only humanitarian aid. But a simple look at satellite tracking, flight logs, and intercepted communications always tell different stories. So why is Abu Dhabi betting on this RSF so much? Because Sudan holds billions in gold reserves, much of which is historically exported to Dubai. The RSF controls the gold mines, and so Sudan sits on a strategic stretch of the Red Sea, where the army previously cancelled a $6 billion Emirati port project. So this is out of spite. By backing the RSF, the UAE is hedging its bets, ensuring influence whichever faction emerges victorious. Simply, in fractured theatres like these, weak governance, corruption mean that a small wealthy state, as we've seen with Qatar and other parts of the world, in this case UAE, are able to wield disproportionate influence. And no amount of US pressure is going to change that unless they really, disregard their own self-interests when it comes to American activities, business and so on in UAE. And considering Trump's recent visit there, I don't think it's going to happen. So this continues then. Emirati weapons, Iranian drones, all make diplomatic solution impossible. Textbook proxy war, and the Sudanese people, as always, paying the highest price. So, with that grim reality in mind, what comes next for Sudan? Well, to me, there are three possible scenarios. Number one, but increasingly possible, is partition. Sudan basically becomes two rival states. The RSF governs Darfur and the West in a rather archaic, rather failed state, unrecognised by much of the international community. Conversely, national Sudanese armed forces rule the more established and infrastructurally strong East. But that would basically just lock in years of proxy warfare with no end in sight and no ability to even remotely describe the atrocities that would follow. Second scenario is prolonged stalemate. Neither side wins, not that they are currently. The war drags on for not just a couple of years, but another decade, hollowing the country into not just a failed state, but a complete collapsed entity stretching from the Sahel to the Red Sea. Keep in mind just how big Sudan is and how many other countries it shares borders with, which would be affected, and some of them, like Chad or Libya, not exactly doing well at the moment either. Or therefore, the third scenario is some kind of external intervention, not in the same way as a foreign set of interference from UAE with arms sales or drones from Iran, but an actual physical military presence. The UN, or more perhaps likely the African Union, under the US or Saudi pressure, finally intervenes with sanctions, peacekeepers, or a negotiated transition, although that seems hard to believe if neither side involved in the fighting is willing to accept that. It's highly unlikely, and I cannot see that being made possible without the Security Council getting anywhere, which would be prevented because of the Russia's veto, and therefore the brutal truth is that both generals still believe that they can win. And as long as the money and weapons keep flowing from abroad, especially those as wealthy as they stand in the Middle East, then, well, this is only going to continue. The point is that Sudan's agony is not just another distant tragedy. It's a warning of what happens when you have power, greed, and international indifference or vested interests colliding. The country's last civil war ended with South Sudan's independence, but, well, has left that country in a non-existent state. This one could end in the same way, or worse, in total fragmentation, with now a husk of a former set of countries around, and it all leading to complete chaos and ultimately breeding into more extremism and risks for other parts of the world, especially Europe. And if that happens, it doesn't stop at Sudan's borders, therefore. It will ripple across everywhere from Egypt to the economic shipping lanes of the Red Sea, and already into, well, potentially driving more instability, coups, and militia uprising across all of Africa, and we return to a period where there has been relative calm to absolute anarchy, and something I don't think any of us want to see. But with that, that's what I want to hear from you guys, whether or not you think that this could be mitigated, we can see an improvement come through with the right actors taking up the right roles, or is it going to get worse still? Let me know in the comments, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say. My name's Pyotr. If you don't know me, I'm a mixed British and Russian, and I have studied and lived across Africa and other parts of the world, working on issues directly related to these, including on South Sudan. And I hope that you take a moment to consider what's happening out there, as well as the other places that are more often reported. We'll see you all in the next one. Take care.